There have been many Pokemon released into Pokemon Go over its lifespan, and most can be obtained through pretty straightforward methods, like through the wild, raids, eggs, or research for example, but some can only be obtained in what I would describe as weird ways. So in this video, we will be looking at 11 of the weirdest Pokemon to obtain in Pokemon Go, and the first being one that has been in the game for almost all of the lifespan of the game, but it still eludes trainers to this day. And don't worry, this is only the beginning, these will be getting more bizarre as we go through the video. So back in November 2016, one of the last Pokemon for the Kanto Dex was released into Pokemon Go, and it was because of its mechanics in the main series games that made it a bit more of a challenge to implement in Pokemon Go. This Pokemon was the transform Pokemon Ditto, which in the main series games can use its transform move to change its appearance and moveset to match that of any other Pokemon, and staying true to it as much as it can. In Pokemon Go, you can't actually catch Ditto in the normal way you would catch other Pokemon. It is found in the wild, but instead of appearing on the overworld map as Ditto, it is disguised as a certain Pokemon that you have to catch before you can tell whether it's Ditto or not. When you catch the Pokemon and it is a Ditto, you will see this screen and the Pokemon will transform into Ditto. Only a few Pokemon are Ditto disguises at a time, and it normally rotates about once a year at this point. And at the time of recording this video, the Ditto disguises are Oddish, Koffing, Rhyhorn, Goldeen, Spinarak, Numel, Bidoof, Gothita, Solosis, Bergmite, and Stuffle. When it comes to battling, however, Ditto is actually quite a bit more complicated than a normal Pokemon. So when used in a gym or a raid battle, it will transform into the Pokemon it's battling, and it'll copy its moveset and typing as it does in the main series games, but it will keep its own level and stats. If you use a Ditto in a Team Go Rocket battle, it actually won't transform, and it can't be used in player versus player battles or in team leader training battles. And since 2021, Ditto has been available as a shiny, but it is only around 2 or 3% of disguised Pokemon that are actually a Ditto, and on top of that, the chance of that Ditto being shiny is 1 in 64. It is a pretty rare shiny outside of certain events when Ditto encounters and shiny rates are boosted. This kind of event happens typically once a year. But it is good to note though, if you do run into a shiny version of a disguised Pokemon, it will never be a Ditto, so don't worry, you won't lose a shiny for a Ditto. And there is another Pokemon that works in a similar way to Ditto. This Pokemon was first released in October 2022 for the first and last 5 minutes of Shuppet Spotlight Hour. However, it was a pretty problematic debut. This Pokemon was Zorua, the tricky fox Pokemon. Similar to Ditto in the main series games, this Pokemon can actually transform into other Pokemon as well, but instead of using a transform move, it uses its ability Illusion. And in Pokemon Go, it was this ability that was used as a basis for its implementation. During the Spotlight Hour for Shuppet in October 2022, Zorua was added as a surprise for trainers in early time zones, but it was really buggy. Zorua works a little bit like Ditto in that you have to catch another Pokemon it is disguised as, and then it'll transform back into Zorua when you catch it. But instead of a group of disguised Pokemon, it will be disguised as the Pokemon you have set as your buddy when it spawns in. So living up to its tricky fox name, it can very often trick you into thinking you found something really rare in the wild, only for it to transform into Zorua when you've caught it. This happens often because generally you will have your buddy set as a rarer Pokemon so you can collect more candy for it. But with the first rollout of Zorua, it had a bit of an issue when transforming back into Zorua after you caught the Pokemon it was disguised as. It would appear like a Zorua in your inventory, but it would take on the stats and the movesets of the Pokemon it was transformed into. This led to some outrageous Zorua with over 3000 CP and some really wild movesets it shouldn't have. So this quickly led to Niantic removing Zorua from the game and re-releasing it a few days later. This time it was a lot less buggy and it worked as intended. Now, whilst Ditto and Zorua are quite different from the standard Pokemon in terms of their acquisition method, however, they aren't the only ones. In Pokemon Go, there is a mechanic that effectively allows you to take a snapshot of a Pokemon in your inventory by clicking this camera icon, or you can click this camera icon whilst playing with your buddy. This can also be done in AR mode, and doing this can occasionally lead to other Pokemon photobombing the picture, and when they do, that Pokemon that photobombs will appear on the overworld map for you to catch. And there is a Pokemon you can only get through this method, and that is Smeargle. This Pokemon was introduced into Pokemon Go in February 2019 along with the snapshot feature, and it was one of the last Johto Pokemon to be implemented, and again, it is an interesting Pokemon in the main series game, and this likely made its development and implementation into Pokemon Go a little bit more difficult than the standard Pokemon. In the main series games, Smeargle has the move Sketch, and this allows it to copy an opponent's move after it's used it and keep it for forever. This can be used to copy pretty much any move with a few exceptions, but how does this translate to Pokemon Go? So all depends on the Pokemon that is the subject of the snapshot you take when Smeargle photobombs it. For example, if you take a picture of Tyranitar and Smeargle photobombs it, when you catch the Smeargle that appears on the overworld map, it will have the same charge attack that Tyranitar had at the time of that snapshot. Smeargle will always copy the first charge attack and and never the second. If the first charge attack is a move that it can't learn, then it will instead learn a random charge attack instead of copying the second charge attack. Some moves that Smeargle can't learn include Transform, Frustration, Return, Mist Ball, Luster Purge, and Shadow Force, amongst others. And worth noting, it also won't copy the type of Hidden Power or Weather Ball. And since its release, it has also been available as shiny, but not in the same way as most Pokemon are. Generally, in Pokemon Go, when a shiny is released, it's released forever, meaning that it can be shiny at any point in time, but for some Pokemon this isn't the case, and one of those is with Smeargle. This Pokemon can't be shiny in Pokemon Go unless it's specified in certain events. In the past, it has been shiny eligible in the Festival of Colors events, Johto Tour, and the new Pokemon Snap celebration where the shiny form originally debuted. During these events, it is normally able to spawn more frequently, because normally you can only get one Smeargle encounter per day, and it normally takes quite a few snapshots to encounter it. So not only do these events make it easier to get Smeargle, but they are the only chance for you to get a shiny as well. After these events are over, Smeargle becomes shiny locked again. Some extra things to note about Smeargle is that each Smeargle encounter will help you level up your Cameraman Platinum medal. You can't use TMs on Smeargle, and it will have any IV combination and be between level 1 to 30. It doesn't get a weather boost. Now there is another Pokemon like Smeargle that can only be shiny during certain events, and it is also a bit of a weird Pokemon to obtain. And much like Zorua, this Pokemon was introduced as a surprise. During Chikorita Community Day in September of 2018, toward the end of the event, a new Pokemon began spawning, one that hadn't been previously released in any Pokemon game at all. This Pokemon was Meltan, and during this Community Day you could interact with Meltan on the overworld map screen, and you could catch it in the encounter screen, but when it was caught it would transform into a Ditto. This was the first teaser of Meltan, however it wasn't released for another 2 months, where it was released alongside a new item, the Mystery Box. And it is this Mystery Box that allows you to catch Meltan. The Mystery Box is an incense-like box that when used allows Pokemon to spawn to your location, but instead of any Pokemon or multiple Pokemon, it can only spawn Meltan to your location. And apart from the rare special research, this is the only way to get Meltan in the game. But getting the Mystery Box is a little bit convoluted. Originally, to get the Mystery Box, you had to have a Nintendo Switch and a copy of Pokemon Let's Go Eevee or Pikachu for the Nintendo Switch, which as you can imagine isn't very accessible at all. And to get the Mystery Box, you had to send a Pokemon from Pokemon Go to Pokemon Let's Go Eevee or Pikachu. But luckily, a couple of years later, the requirements to do this became a lot more accessible, and you no longer had to have a Nintendo Switch and a copy of Let's Go Eevee or Pikachu. Instead, you could transfer a Pokemon from Pokemon Go to Pokemon Home, which is a free-to-use app, although it does have a premium plan, but it's not required for this. And there is a Pokemon that I will be talking about later that unfortunately didn't receive a quality of life update like this, and you still need a Nintendo Switch to get this Pokemon, but more on that later. So to transfer a Pokemon to Pokemon Home, all you have to do is first link your Pokemon Go account with your Pokemon Home account. To do this, open Pokemon Go, navigate to the settings, tap connected devices and services, and sign in with the Nintendo account that you have associated with your Pokemon Home account. From the Pokemon Home section, you can then tap send, pick a Pokemon and send it to Pokemon Home using the Pokemon Go transporter. There is a limited amount of energy in the Pokemon transporter that you can use to send a Pokemon, but it will recharge over time, and the amount of energy used to transfer a Pokemon depends on the Pokemon you pick to send. You can also fully recharge the Pokemon Go transporter by using Poké Coins if you wanted to, but it only requires you to send one Pokemon to Pokemon Home to receive a mystery box in Pokemon Go. You can then use the mystery box from your item list, and it will activate for 60 minutes, spawning Meltan to your location, and you'll get an encounter every 30 to 60 seconds roughly. Then after you've used the mystery box, you can use it again 3 days later by sending another Pokemon. There are, however, some Pokemon you can't send to Pokemon Home. These include Costume Pokemon and Shadow Pokemon and Mega Evolved Pokemon, amongst others. And the shiny version of Meltan is available, but the only way to get it is during certain events that specifically list it, much like Smeargle. Outside of these events, any Meltan that you encounter from the mystery box can't be shiny. Now to get this Pokemon, it does require a feature that isn't used that often, but there are some trainers that utilize Pokemon Go for its ability to get rare Pokemon they can then send on to Pokemon Home and to main series games. But the next Pokemon on the list is even more bizarre because it forces you to use a mechanic in Pokemon Go that is barely ever used, and the mechanic itself doesn't really have any other benefits other than getting the Pokemon in question. So back in December 2021, a new feature was added to Pokemon Go that would build upon the gift system. So in game you can interact with friends on your friends list by sending and receiving gifts that are picked up from Pokestops. These gifts contain some items like berries and Pokeballs that can be really helpful, especially for those rurally located trainers that don't have access to many Pokestops. And in December 2021, the postcard book was introduced. So a gift has a location attached to it from where it was picked up before it was sent. And the trainer that receives the gift can see the location where the gift came from. And the idea of the postcard book was that you could pin the postcard that comes with the gift, so you can keep a record record of where the gifts initially came from. So people generally do this if the gift has come from a location they're interested in. And like I mentioned before, whilst a nice addition to the game, it wasn't really used much because there wasn't really an incentive to use it. However, it was a year later that this changed. In December 2022, Scatterbug, Spewper, and Vivillon were added to the game, and to get these Pokemon you had to use the postcard system. To get an encounter with Scatterbug from pinning postcards, you do need a certain amount of pinned postcards from that real life region, depending on how many encounters you've had with a Scatterbug from that region before. So sometimes when you pin a postcard and you return to the overworld map screen, you do get an encounter straight away with Scatterbug. However, this isn't always the case. Sometimes you do need to head to your profile screen, scroll down to the badges, and then tap on the Vivillon collector medal. Then you can scroll down and see all of the different patterns from the different regions, which regions each of the patterns come from, and how many postcards from that region you need to pin to get an encounter with Scatterbug. And it is from here, if you pinned enough postcards from a specific region to get an encounter, that you will see the wild catch icon, and if you tap on that, you will get an encounter with Scatterbug. And depending on the region that the Scatterbug encounter is from, will determine the Vivillon pattern. Compared to the average Pokemon, this is quite a weird one to obtain, and getting each of the Vivillon patterns, of which there are 18 in Pokemon Go, is quite the task, especially with the shinies having now been released as well in February of 2025, almost 3 years after its debut. So getting all of these patterns shiny will be quite a task. But at least obtaining Scatterbug can be done with friends all around the world. But this next Pokemon requires you to have friends you can play the game with in person, and this is because you have to use Party Play. Party Play was released in Pokemon Go in October 2023, and it essentially allows you and up to 3 friends in person to join a party together in game. You can either host or join a party, and you can do this with QR codes through the trainer profile menu by tapping on host or join a party. And whilst in a party, party challenges and party power will be active. Party power increases the damage done by your Pokemon's charge attacks when in a raid with a party member. This is actually pretty strong and well worth using whenever you can, because it can really help you defeat a raid boss with fewer trainers. But it is from party challenges that you complete with your party that you can get a Pokemon that outside of special events can't be obtained in any other way. And that Pokemon is Tandemaus and its evolution Maushold. This Pokemon has been made available from research in a couple of events in the past, but other than that, it doesn't appear outside of Party Play. So unless you have somebody you can party up with in person to complete a load of challenges and hopefully get this encounter, because it is in a pool of possible encounters and it isn't always available, then you might have to just wait for these certain events to get it from research. And not only are these some steep requirements to get a Tandemaus encounter in Pokemon Go, its evolution Maushold makes it even more complicated. This is because Maushold has 2 forms, and you can get them both by evolving Tandemaus, but one of the 2 forms, the family of 3 version, is a lot rarer than the family of 4 version of Maushold. This means if you are trying to obtain the family of 3 version, it will probably take a lot of time because it is a 1 in 100 chance. So you will need to probably evolve a lot of Tandemaus and use a lot of candy. Now the next few Pokemon are some of the weirdest Pokemon to obtain on this list. But first I want to go through 3 encounters which aren't necessarily weird to obtain, but they're definitely unique compared to other legendary Pokemon, which are normally locked to raids or rarely in research in Pokemon Go. Back in July of 2022, a new item was added to the game. It was a new version of the incense that you could use once per day for free, and it would last for 15 minutes. It works the same as a regular incense, with Pokemon spawning every 30 seconds if you move a certain distance in a straight line within that time limit. And there are quite a lot of different Pokemon that can spawn on the daily incense, including the legendary Galarian birds Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno. Outside of some rare research, Go Tour events, and the Lake Trio, these are the only legendary Pokemon that appear outside of raids, and they are exclusive to the daily incense. This makes them a bit of an out of the ordinary addition to the game. But when it comes to obtaining them, they can be very elusive. Unlike the average Pokemon, the Galarian birds are firstly very rare to encounter from the daily incense, even though nowadays you can use Origin Dialga's Roar of Time adventure effect to extend the daily incense up to 24 hours if you have the resources to do so. Even with this adventure effect coming to the game almost 2 years after the daily incense release, the Galarian birds are still very rare to see. To improve your chances, you can walk at a brisk pace in a straight line to make sure the game calculates the distance properly, because it won't calculate the distance around a corner, it only calculates distance in a straight line. Other than this, they can also spawn more frequently in windy weather because of their typing. But encountering them is only half of the battle. Unlike average Pokemon encounters, these birds have a 90% flee rate and a 0.3% catch rate, meaning they are very hard to catch, and you will most likely only get 1 ball to try and catch it before it runs from you. This makes them a pretty likely target for a Master Ball. Not only that, but since October 2024, they can also be shiny, and that means roughly 5% of the time you will encounter a shiny, and when you do encounter a shiny, they actually can't run. However, they do still have a very low catch rate, so make sure you've got Golden Raspberries and Ultra Balls. All of this tied together does make these 3 unique Pokemon to encounter, but they aren't quite as weird to encounter as the next few Pokemon. Next up is a Pokemon that was introduced in Pokemon Legends Arceus as a new evolution for Ursaring. This Pokemon is Ursaluna. Now in Pokemon Legends Arceus, in order to evolve Ursaring into Ursaluna, it required an item called a Peat Block, and you had to use it on Ursaring when the full moon was active in the game. And with Ursaluna's implementation into Pokemon Go, the Peat Block was dropped, but the full moon requirement was kept. So obtaining Ursaluna in Pokemon Go is kinda weird compared to other standard Pokemon, because you can only evolve Ursaring when there is a full moon active in Pokemon Go. And this only happens roughly once a month, and it is based on the real world moon schedule. However, there is a way to get around this evolution requirement, so you can do it without the full moon. And to do this, you need to have a Dawn Wings Necrozma. This Pokemon's signature move, Moongeist Beam, has an adventure effect that works a little bit like an incense, spawning Pokemon to your avatar's location. And the pool of Pokemon that can spawn are generally Pokemon that can spawn at night. But it is the other effect of this adventure effect that's even more important. This secondary effect allows Pokemon to evolve that require the nighttime whenever you use this effect. So the idea is that you can use this adventure effect even in the daytime, so you can then evolve nighttime evolutions. And these include evolving Eevee into Umbreon, Amora into Aurorus, Rockruff into Midnight Lycanroc, Cosmoem into Lunala, and it allows Ursaring to evolve into Ursaluna without the full moon. So this is a really useful workaround, but it will cost you 3 Necrozma candy and 3000 Stardust, and the candy can be hard to come by, but you can always use rare candies for this. Now the next Pokemon integrated into the game had players waiting for a long time. The Hoenn region was first introduced into Pokemon Go back in 2017, but it wasn't for over 6 years until the last Hoenn Pokemon was added to the game. The color swap Pokemon Kecleon was added to the game in January 2023, right after Chespin Community Day. And much like Ditto, Zorua, and Smeargle, it is a main series mechanic of Kecleon's color swap that kept Kecleon from debuting for so long. Color swap allows Kecleon's body to turn invisible and blend in with the surroundings. And in the main series games, it is an ability that allows Kecleon to change type to the type of attack it was hit by last. But here's the thing about Kecleon in Pokemon Go, it's not very easy to find. Instead of appearing in the wild like most Pokemon, Kecleon hides on pokéstops. When you try to spin a stop, you might sometimes notice an invisible figure blocking it. You then need to tap on the Pokemon a couple of times until it jumps off, and then it'll appear on the overworld map ready to catch. It is quite a rare Pokemon to find outside of certain events, so your best bet is going to places where there are a lot of pokéstops and checking as many as you can. Now let's talk about a mysterious Pokemon that left trainers confused for quite a long time. Back in November 2022, players started spotting golden pokéstops, and along with the golden coins you could get from it, it did turn out they were connected to Gimmighoul, and this was a brand new Pokemon at the time that was from Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. And a few months later, it officially became part of Pokemon Go on February 27th, 2023 for Pokemon Day. So how do you get Gimmighoul? Well, unlike most Pokemon, you can't find it in the wild. You need to follow a few steps to get an encounter with it. Firstly, you need a copy of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and a Nintendo Switch to play it on, because this method requires you to link Pokemon Scarlet or Violet to Pokemon Go. Once you've set that up, open Pokemon Go and go to your settings. Scroll down until you see the connected devices and services section, then tap on Nintendo Switch and select connect to Pokemon Scarlet or Violet. Now go to your Nintendo Switch, open Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and go to the Poke Portal. Select Mystery Gift, then choose connect to Pokemon Go. This will then link your devices. Next, you need to send a postcard from Pokemon Go to Pokemon Scarlet or Violet. To do this, go to your postcard book in Pokemon Go, select any postcard you've saved from a Pokestop and tap send to Nintendo Switch. As soon as you send it, you'll get a special item in Pokemon Go, the coin bag. The coin bag works very similar to the Meltan mystery box. When you activate it, roaming form Gimmighoul will start spawning around you for a limited time, giving you the chance to catch multiple Gimmighoul in one session, and you can use the coin bag once per day. Now here's where it gets even more tricky. Evolving Gimmighoul into Golden Go isn't that easy. Instead of using candy, you will need 999 Gimmighoul coins, which you can get by catching Gimmighoul and spinning golden Pokestops. It's also worth noting that you can make golden Pokestops yourself using a golden lure module. To get this, you have to send a postcard to Pokemon Scarlet or Violet on 5 different days. And often players do meetups called golden lure parties, where each trainer brings a golden lure module and you all place them down on different Pokestops in the area, so everyone can benefit from each other's golden lures. These types of meetups can get the 999 Gimmighoul coin grind done pretty quickly. And perhaps the most weird Pokemon to obtain is Malamar. So its first form, Inkay, is a normal Pokemon to obtain through the standard means of the game, such as the wild and research, etc. But unless you know a specific trick that the game doesn't really hint much towards, then you won't be able to evolve this Pokemon normally with candy. So if you go to Inkay in your inventory and you have the required 50 candy, you will see that the evolve button is not active, meaning that you can't evolve the Pokemon. And if you tap the evolve button, it will say that this is a special evolution and Inkay needs some help evolving. The only hint really for this evolution is the question mark that appears upside down. So what you have to do is turn your phone upside down, and then you'll see the evolve button become active and you can proceed with the evolution into Malamar. But why is this the way to evolve Inkay? Well, this quirk is a reference to the mainline Pokemon games where players had to physically turn their Nintendo 3DS systems upside down to trigger the evolution. Now these are some of the weirdest Pokemon to obtain in Pokemon Go, but they're not necessarily the rarest. But if you do want to know what are the rarest Pokemon to obtain in Pokemon Go, then I recommend checking out this video on the screen now, and I'll catch you in the next one.